Reading the Times for Saturday, February 15th, 2020. William Barr moves to take the reins of politically charged cases. The disclosures came as Mr. Trump made clear on Friday that he believes he has free rein over the Justice Department and its cases, rejecting Mr. Barr's public demand of a day earlier that the president stop commenting on such cases. Hours later, the Justice Department told defense lawyers for Andrew G. McCabe, the former acting FBI director whom Mr. Trump has vilified for his role in the Russia case, that Mr. McCabe would not be charged in connection with the leak case, ending a nearly 2-year criminal investigation. Though the president fired Mr. Flynn, Mr. Trump has long derided the case against him, wishing him luck on Twitter, praising Ms. Powell, and calling the case a disgrace. China's doctors fighting the coronavirus beg for masks. Even as Chinese officials disclosed how many medical workers have been sickened and killed by the virus, key questions remain unanswered, experts say, including how the workers became infected and whether the rate of transmission was slowing. Outside the Wuhan 4th Hospital, medical workers waited near a truck as a delivery man in a full-body medical suit handed down boxes of masks and gowns. Just a week later, Chinese Politburo Standing Committee, the Communist Party's topmost council, said problems with insufficient beds, medical personnel, and other medical resources persisted across Hubei. Russians pressure U.S. forces in northeast Syria. The Russians have swamped the deconfliction channel set up for direct communications between American and Russian forces to avoid confrontations, with requests to operate in American patrolled areas. The Russians then ignored American objections and traveled there anyway. The prevalence of Syrian and Russian forces is an issue not just on the ground, but also in the air, where a large number of reconnaissance drones and other aircraft have eroded American air superiority, one American defense official said. The last time pro-Syrian government forces and allied Russian mercenaries threatened American troops near the oil fields in February 2018, the United States unleashed an artillery and aerial bombardment that left 200 to 300 of the attacking fighters dead. After American and Russian commanders agreed in late 2017 to fly on opposite sides of a 45-mile stretch of the Euphrates to prevent accidents in eastern Syria's increasingly congested skies, Russian warplanes violated that deal half a dozen times a day, American commanders said. An old and contested solution to boost reading scores. Phonics. Ari Cotton, a first grader, reading a book at Garrison Elementary School in Washington, D.C., one of only 2 jurisdictions in the country that saw rising test scores on national reading tests last year. Their effort gained new urgency after national test scores last year showed that only a third of American students were proficient in reading, with widening gaps between good readers and bad ones. Now, members of this vocal minority, proponents of what they call the science of reading, congregate on social media and swap lesson plans intended to avoid creating curriculum casualties, students who have not been effectively taught to read and who will continue to struggle into adulthood, unable to comprehend medical forms, news stories, or job listings. What being a mayor taught Pete Buttigieg. Former Vice President Joseph R. Biden, Jr., fighting for the same center-left voters as Mr. Buttigieg, released a digital ad ahead of New Hampshire voting, openly mocking Mr. Buttigieg's qualifications. To Oliver Davis, a former South Bend City Council member who often tangled with Mr. Buttigieg, the former mayor is simply too green. Jake Teshka, the only Republican on the South Bend City Council, said that Mr. Buttigieg won his support for one initiative to address lead poisoning, requiring city inspections of rental units, over Mr. Teshka's initial objection. A crisis right now. San Francisco and Manila face rising seas. Around the time her parents built their house in Malabon, Mr. Raymond, a bankruptcy lawyer, bought his house on a bluff on the edge of the sea. The only thing that protects his property from a rising sea, he knows, is a publicly funded seawall right out front, erected to safeguard a sewer line and a coastal road. In a bad storm, when the waves pound that wall, his house shakes. First came a crowded little island, then a few solitary houses standing on berms, then many more abandoned houses with window frames staring out like vacant eyes. Boris Johnson moves boldly to consolidate power. When Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain convened his new cabinet on Friday, it looked less like a conclave of powerful government officials than a well-mannered classroom on the day the headmaster came to visit. Mr. Javid, an ally of Mr. Johnson's, resigned rather than have many of his powers stripped and handed over to Mr. Johnson's aides in 10 Downing Street. As Mr. Johnson consolidated his grip on government, his aides were busy trying to douse questions over who paid for an expensive holiday vacation for the Prime Minister on the chic Caribbean island of Mustique. Fire kills 17 at unaccredited orphanage in Haiti. The orphanage in a suburb of Port-au-Prince is run by the Church of Bible Understanding, a group that describes itself as a small Christian fellowship with a presence in New York, Florida, and California, along with Pennsylvania, and an involvement in Haiti since 1977. The group did not immediately respond to requests for comments sent to its email address and left in a voicemail message at its office in Scranton, Pennsylvania. A woman who answered the phone at the group's office in Haiti declined to comment and did not identify herself. The orphanage's staff had been taken to a local police precinct for questioning, while the surviving children have been relocated to another orphanage. According to its website, the group opened its first orphanage in Haiti about 4 decades ago with 6 children and now runs 2 orphanages with about 150 children and supports others with weekly food deliveries. He observed a protest. Now he faces a possible life sentence. The 18th of February will be the funeral of civil society in Turkey. Mr. Aksakoglu said, one of Mr. Aksakoglu's co-defendants is Osman Kavala, a well-known philanthropist, often called Turkey's George Soros, who has been in jail for over 2 years. Mr. Aksakoglu's fate is indicative of just how twisted Turkey's justice system has become. Someone who pulled himself up thanks to a state education is seeing his career crushed by his own government. Hurricane Dorian ravaged Bahamas reefs, researchers find. We saw it on several reefs that a significant amount of corals were broken, rolled around on the bottom, and killed or just mashed up to the point that the actual structure of the reef itself was reduced to rubble, said Craig Dahlgren, a lead researcher at the Perry Institute, which has been examining effects of the hurricane since October. In 2016, the Perry Institute, based in Waitsfield, Vermont, found reefs in the Bahamas to be under stress and classified them as impaired, the category just above poor. Researchers from the Perry Institute have studied reefs in the Bahamas for years. Macron ally withdraws Paris mayoral bid after sexual videos emerge. Mr. G.A.O announced he was dropping out after the video began circulating publicly on Wednesday evening. Mr. Pavlensky told Liberation that he published the videos to expose Mr. G.A.O as a hypocritical because the candidate invoked family values and always mentioned his wife and children as an example during the campaign. Mr. G.A.O's withdrawal announcement prompted dozens of people across the political spectrum to express their support for Mr. G.A.O and to denounce what some called revolting attacks. Germany says it's broken up a far-right terrorism network. About the same time, a number of police officers in the Frankfurt region came under investigation on suspicion of taking part in extremist chat groups. In January, the police raided the homes of people belonging to an organization known as Neo-Nazi Group Combat 18, confiscating weapon parts, among other things. Herbert Reul, the Interior Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia State, told reporters that a man who had been charged with supporting the group had worked for the police. U.S. and Taliban agreed to reduce violence in first step to peace deal. The United States and the Taliban have agreed to a significant reduction in violence for 7 days, a senior Trump administration official said on Friday, the first step in a plan to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan and possibly end the long war there. Afghan leaders have been frustrated by the United States acceding to the Taliban's demand that negotiations held over the past year in Doha, Qatar, exclude the government, even as deadly violence continue. In September, American and Taliban negotiators were close to an agreement, and Mr. Trump planned to meet Taliban leaders in person before he dropped the deal after a Taliban attack. U.S. supports aid to North Korea for fighting the coronavirus. North Korea's public health system is dysfunctional, and the travel restrictions have made it harder for North Korea to buy or smuggle medicine, goods, or other supplies from China. Liberty Post Korea, a Seoul-based website run by a North Korean defector, reported last week that 4,000 North Koreans had been placed under special monitoring for symptoms in one northern province bordering China, and that 720 had been quarantined in hospitals. The coronavirus emerged as North Korea seemed to be retreating from a period of relative openness, with the diplomacy between Kim Jong-un and President Trump having produced no concrete agreements on ending the North's nuclear arms program or the international sanctions. Coronavirus hits all the hot buttons for how we misjudge risk. Experts used to believe that people gauged risk like actuaries parsing out cost-benefit analysis every time a merging car came too close or local crime rates spiked. One is dread. If a risk seemed especially painful or disturbing, people tend to raise their estimate of how likely it is to happen to them. One study found that people will raise their threshold for the amount of danger they are willing to take on by a factor of 1,000 if they see the risk as voluntary. They documented the coronavirus crisis in Wuhan, then they vanished. Experts used to believe that people gauged risk. Oh, shoot, I have to fix this one. Technical difficulties. We're just going to have to skip this one. Okay. I'm sorry, people who vanished in Wuhan. We're going to guess this article. They documented the coronavirus in Wuhan, then they vanished. Vivian Wang probably said that people were checking the virus in Wuhan. Like most articles about China, it's negative and talking about how the Chinese government's fucked up. That seems to be the narrative of the New York Times. Thermometer guns on coronavirus front lines are notoriously not accurate. Sometimes described as a thermometer gun, the device is equipped with an infrared sensor that can quickly measure surface temperature without making any contact with a person's skin. The thermometer guns are used only for quick screening and are not as accurate as traditional thermometers, Mr. Mo said. During past outbreaks, some checkpoints have used cameras or thermometer guns that were designed for industrial purposes, like measuring the temperature of a vehicle, rather than finely calibrated medical tools. Violin lessons during the coronavirus outbreak, a pupil's progress. Kevin seemed lethargic, like he hadn't practiced, and Kevin always practiced. Kevin's family remains healthy, but Kevin has mostly been stuck inside. The day after the lesson early this month, she messaged Kevin and his family and asked if they would like to temporarily step up Kevin's lessons at no extra cost. Beijing tightens quarantine rule in coronavirus battle. The authorities in China tightened their coronavirus quarantine rules for Beijing on Friday, saying that all residents returning from outside the capital would be required to isolate themselves for 14 days. As of Friday, the coronavirus had infected more than 66,000 people, nearly all of them in mainland China, including more than 1,700 medical workers, and killed more than 1,500 people, all but 3 of them in mainland China. Even before Beijing issued its new rules, the so-called neighborhood committees had been playing an increasingly assertive role across the country, including in Shanghai, the country's largest city. We checked the Iowa caucus math. Here's where it didn't add up. Since the troubled Iowa caucuses on February 3rd, the state Democratic Party has revised the results for about 100 of the state's 1,765 precincts, and officials are still scrambling to verify dozens more precinct results after reports of widespread inconsistencies. Each precinct sends a number of delegates, real people chosen by caucus attendees, to a county convention, where each delegate casts a vote for one candidate based on the outcome of the caucus. In 21 precincts, candidates who did not earn enough support to win any delegates appear to have won them anyways. White House memo justifying Soleimani strike cites no imminent threat. The White House told Congress on Friday that President Trump authorized the strike last month that killed Iran's most important general to respond to attacks that had already taken place and defer future ones, contradicting the president's claim that he acted in response to an imminent threat. In a legal mandated 2-page unclassified memo to lawmakers, the White House asserted that the strike that killed Major General Qasem Soleimani was in response to an escalating series of attacks in preceding months by Iran and Iran-backed militias. The purpose of this action was to protect United States personnel, to deter Iran from conducting or supporting further attacks against the United States forces and interests, to degrade Iran's and Quds force-backed militias' abilities to conduct attacks, and to end Iran's strategic escalation of attacks, said the report, which was transmitted on Friday to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Michael Avenatti is convicted in Nike extortion trial. A lawyer for Mr. Avenatti, Scott Schriebnick, said by email Friday that Mr. Avenatti planned to appeal the conviction. Aged like a fine wine, Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, wrote on Twitter, posting an October 2018 message from Mr. Avenatti that predicted the younger Mr. Trump would be indicted by the end of the year. Though Mr. Avenatti had suggested that he believed the charges against him are politically motivated, prosecutors have noted that the IRS's investigation of him dated to September 2016, before President Trump was elected and well before Mr. Avenatti began representing Ms. Daniels. Appeals court rejects Trump Medicaid work requirements in Arkansas. A federal appeals court panel on Friday unanimously upheld a lower court's ruling striking down work rules for Medicaid recipients in Arkansas, casting more doubt over broader Trump administration efforts to require poor people to work, volunteer, or train for a job as a condition of getting government health coverage. The rules require able-bodied adults to report to the state every month that they have worked, searched or trained for a job, taken classes, or volunteered in order to keep receiving Medicaid health coverage, which is largely free. In approving Medicaid work rules under a waiver program that allows states to spend federal Medicaid funds in a way that would not normally be allowed, Mr. Azer said the objective was to improve health outcomes. Border Patrol will deploy elite tactical agents to sanctuary cities. Among the agents being deployed to sanctuary cities are members of the elite tactical unit known as BORTAC, which acts essentially as the SWAT team of the Border Patrol. In a statement, ICE's acting director, Matthew T. Albence, said the deployment comes in response to policies adopted by sanctuary cities, which have made it harder for immigration agents to do their jobs. Unlike operations on the border where BORTAC agents may engage in armed confrontations with drug smuggling suspects using armored vehicles, immigration agents in cities are enforcing civil rather than criminal infractions. Andrew McCabe, ex-FBI official, will not be charged in lying case. Andrew G. McCabe, the former deputy FBI director and a frequent target of President Trump, will not face charges in an investigation into whether he lied to investigators about a media leak, his defense team said on Friday. Mr. McCabe has been a consistent foil for Mr. Trump, who repeatedly attacked Mr. McCabe's wife, Jill, over her failed 2015 campaign for Virginia Senate, which received hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations from a political committee run by a longtime ally of the Clintons. Few events have represented a more profound breach of public trust than your decision to allow the Clinton email investigation to be overseen by Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe, whose wife, Jill McCabe, received approximately $700,000 in campaign donations steered to her by a top Clinton surrogate, Mr. Trump wrote. How Trump's relationship with Barr got so complicated. In a morning tweet, Mr. Trump quoted Mr. Barr saying that the president has never asked me to do anything in a criminal case. The president said he had so far chosen not to interfere in a criminal case, even though he insisted he was not legally bound to do so. Past presidents in both parties have respected long-standing traditions that are aimed at preventing political influence from the White House on Justice Department investigations, especially criminal inquiries that involved administration officials or friends of the president. The rules have been in place since the Watergate investigation, in which President Richard M. Nixon sought to pressure the FBI. Mr. Trump has repeatedly ignored those traditions, making contact with FBI officials and communicating with top Justice Department officials through Twitter and in person. Another caucus is coming, but Nevada will look completely different. Nevada is arguably the first true indicator of the electability of these Democratic candidates, said Dan Lee, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Running a campaign is a lot harder in a state like Nevada versus Iowa or New Hampshire because you've got to run a bilingual campaign and you've got to work harder to reach voters and even harder to actually convince these voters to caucus, he said. Look at the 2018 midterms. Turnout in Nevada was actually quite high because candidates were running really robust campaigns in Nevada to get people engaged. Ads in Spanish. Obama cameos. The Democratic ad race in Nevada and South Carolina. With many campaigns now strapped for cash as they head towards Super Tuesday on March 3rd, their messaging and the money they can put behind it may foreshadow who will be a force in a national campaign and who will run into a wall. While there has been some campaigning in Nevada, the voters aren't nearly as tuned in as Iowa and New Hampshire, so it will be very important to get the campaign messages in front of voters, said Kelly Gibson, a Democratic media strategist who advised the campaigns of Andrew Yang and Julian Castro. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, whose campaign recently announced a 7-figure ad buy in Nevada and South Carolina, is recycling 2 ads from New Hampshire, including a rapid flip through her plan for her first 100 days as president. Bill de Blasio endorses Bernie Sanders. Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York, whose brief presidential campaign failed to get off the ground last year, will endorse Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont for the Democratic nomination, according to people familiar with plans. Mr. de Blasio was expected to travel with Mr. Sanders on Sunday and Monday in Nevada, but they will appear together at canvassing events ahead of the caucuses there on February 22nd. Mr. de Blasio and Mr. Sanders have spoken several times since the mayor ended his presidential campaign in September. Mr. Sanders swore Mr. de Blasio at the inauguration for his second term as mayor. Toppled but not gone. UNC grapples anew with fate of Silent Sam. The university thought it had found an answer in November when it reached an agreement to give the statue to the North Carolina division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and fund a $2.5 million trust to display it somewhere off campus. At its dedication, a former Confederate soldier named Julian Carr delivered a speech praising the Confederate Army for saving the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South, and recalled that he had horsewhipped a black woman until her skirt hung in shreds because she had publicly insulted a white woman. Transferring the statue to the Sons of Confederate Veterans was a reasonable way to comply with the law while ensuring public safety and returning the campus to normalcy. Ripley Rand, a lawyer for the university board, said in court on Wednesday, according to a video of the hearing posted by WRAL, a television station in Raleigh. The progressive lane narrows. Miss Warren maintains that she is the person to build that coalition, that she will outlast flashier candidates and eventually make voters see the rightness of her position. If Miss Warren is the progressive of high-minded policy, Bernie Sanders is a progressive of belligerent revolution. As Miss Warren has faded, Mr. Sanders has consolidated progressives behind him, while moderates remain split between multiple contenders. California takes revenge on Trump. If you look at the changing politics of Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona, all fast-growing states packed with new arrivals from California, the answer is yes. The most endangered species, California Republicans, make the most noise about how awful the state is. He'd prefer dystopia on the Pacific, largely because he lost the Golden State by more than 4 million votes. Trump's Whisper Network. Which brings me to what is perhaps the biggest whisper network of all, the one involving inner flashes of sympathy, frequently tipping into support at the ballot box for President Trump. Beyond the question of why most people might want to conceal their voting preferences, reputation management, social harmony, and so on, it's worth asking whether the very fact that a vote for Trump was supposed to be shameful is also what made it so attractive. For every voter who pulled the lever for Trump out of sympathy for his views, how many others did so out of a disdain for the army of snickering moralists, telling them that a vote for Trump was unpardonable? The specific horror of unwanted oral sex. One summer night, that man walked me home from dinner. Here's one sick part. I don't feel good using the word assault. Part of the reason is my feeling of complicity. I remember with an indescribable nausea that I didn't want the man to feel like he was not doing a good job. Even just writing those words makes me feel powerless, existentially subjugated. How Trump is running to snatch a victory from the jaws of defeat again. Our conclusion is that even if the general population prefers the Democratic nominee by much more than was the case in 2016, Mr. Trump has almost a 1/3 chance of winning the Electoral College while ignoring the national vote, but only about 1/5 chance of winning the national popular vote as a route to winning the Electoral College. If the candidates don't work to get out the vote in a state, and the state's result is not likely to be close under a winner-take-all system of the Electoral College, then people in that state tend to not bother to vote. Another view is that the statistics of modern presidential voting explain the Republican preference. As things stand today, the Electoral College gives the Republican nominee a better chance of winning than would a popular vote. Let college kids resolve problems themselves? Dr. Friedman, tisk admonishment to parents seeking to help their college students is typical of the insular world of higher education. Roughly 1/3 of students in the United States attend community colleges. Many, including those at 4-year institutions, work full or part-time while raising families of their own. As the parent of 2 children who graduated from college, I certainly empathize with parents who help guide their kids with a heavy hand at times. Barr's rebuke of President Trump. Genius or feigned? His kabuki theater act feigning dismay over the president's tweets criticizing the Justice Department is more likely a clever feint to divert attention away from his own malfeasance than an expression of real dismay over Mr. Trump's behavior. Attorney General William Barr has been a bit slower than most of us to understand who Donald Trump is. Now he has apparently caught on. Mr. Trump, he says, is making it impossible for me to do my job. So does Mr. Barr have the integrity to resign, as some other Justice Department officials have done, or will he remain in office collecting a paycheck for the duties he says he can't perform? Curtailing free speech. Poor recycling rates in New York City are also attributable to the residents themselves. What percentage of New Yorkers even know that recycling is the law? New York. The writer is founding chair of the Residential Recycling Committee of the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board. So I actually read this article in full. It was about the chalking, not allowing people to chalk on campus, and saying it's dangerous to not allow people to express any viewpoints, even if they're radical, in chalk on the sidewalk. But you lose something. The algorithm, the summary bot is not perfect. Taming the Wild West of New York's dangerous private trash trucks. The city will be carved into 20 commercial waste zones with just 3 companies working in each, essentially forcing trucks to drive more efficient routes. Workers with the hauler Sanitation Salvage said an apparently homeless man had jumped on the trucks and fallen off. Mr. Diallo, an immigrant, had been working on the trucks off the books, a common industry practice, workers said. Weinstein has the mark of a predator, prosecutors say, as the trial nears end. Standing before the jury on Friday, Ms. Eluzzi sought to counter that narrative, arguing that Mr. Weinstein purposefully maintained ties with his victims to keep them under his control. The indictment rests on the accusations of 2 women, Miriam Haley, a former reality TV show production assistant, who testified that Mr. Weinstein forcibly performed oral sex on her at his Tribeca apartment in 2006, and Jessica Mann, an aspiring actress from a small town in Washington state, who claimed he raped her at a Midtown Manhattan hotel room in 2013. Both women acknowledged during cross-examination that they not only had friendly interactions with Mr. Weinstein after their alleged attacks, but later had consensual sex with him. In the defense closing arguments on Thursday, Donna Rotuno, Mr. Weinstein's lead lawyer, said several times that the accusers in the case had chosen to engage in consensual sex with him to advance their careers, and their decisions to visit Mr. Weinstein in hotels and at his apartment supported that argument. A New York councilman faces ethics charges for a 3rd time. On Friday, the council's ethics committee announced new charges, including disorderly conduct and conflict of interest violations against Mr. King, a Bronx Democrat. Council member King has repeatedly disgraced his office with his actions, Mr. Johnson said in a statement. A 2/3 vote is required to expel a city council member, something that has not happened since the city charter was revised in 1989. Once the Ethics Committee releases the report with its findings and recommendations, the full council could vote again on Mr. King's fate. Why the NYPD subpoenaed a reporter's Twitter feed. Mr. Al-Fiki, who has credentials for the police department identifying him as a news media photographer, refused orders from officers to stop filming, the police said. The police department's issuing of the order also raised worries amongst free speech advocates about how the agency uses its subpoena power. One wonders whether they can just issue subpoenas willy-nilly when anybody in the police department feels like it, Mr. Friedman says. BlackRock becomes a symbol for anti-capitalist fervor in France. The protest escalated with the action on Monday morning when environmental activists who allege French workers' pensions could be directed by BlackRock stormed the company's offices. Opponents seized on a public BlackRock analyst note describing pension investment options in France, a sign they said that Wall Street's biggest asset manager was seeking to profit. French media ran articles highlighting BlackRock's assessment as a sign that the company is eager to see France's state-run pension scheme tilt toward the American system, where workers often save for pensions through investments. 3 steps to a socially conscious portfolio. Once you decide on your approach, you have another choice. Active management, where fund managers handpick the contents of a portfolio company by company, or passive management, where they might license an index. Active funds tend to have higher fees, particularly for international funds, where more expensive research may be necessary. The least likely list included 5 of the 10 largest fund companies: American funds, dimensional funds, T. Rowe Price, Vanguard, and BlackRock, which shouted from the rooftops last month that it really, truly intends to care more about these sorts of things from this point forward. Shuttered stores, fewer tourists. Luxury feels coronavirus effects. Along with widespread shutdowns of stores and malls in China, it has taken a heavy toll on the global luxury goods sector, long dependent on the spending of Chinese shoppers at home and abroad. Some fear that the sector could be facing its worst crisis since the global financial meltdown of 2008. The investment bank Jefferies estimates that Chinese buyers account for 40% of the 281 billion euros, or 305 billion, spent on luxury goods globally last year, and drove 80% of past year's sales growth in the sector, making them the fastest growing luxury shopper demographic in the world. Luxury spending has hit a sudden stop in China, with sales either at zero for most brands or down by at least 80%, said Luca Solca, a global luxury goods market analyst at Bernstein. Assuming a 20% drop in Chinese consumption in the second quarter of 2020, UBS predicts a 3% decrease in earnings per share for brands like LVMH and Hermès, compared with an 8% for Richemont and 7% for Burberry, which has particularly high exposure to China. That's racist. U.S. watchdog to investigate Trump's farm bailout program. The investigation came at the request of Senator Debbie Stabenow, a Michigan Democrat who has been vocal in her concern that the aid program was biased, providing more funds to southern states that voted for Mr. Trump and favoring large and foreign agriculture companies over small farms. Ms. Stabenow requested that the G.A.O. study why payments disproportionately went to large farm operations, if the Agriculture Department was effectively preventing fraud, waste, and abuse in the program, and whether the model the USDA used to distribute payments accurately reflected trade damage that farmers experienced. Democrats have complained that the program paid subsidies to some farmers that did not need them, while leaving those that were suffering from Mr. Trump's tariff war with China without a benefit. Coronavirus begins to sap growth as Europe's economy slows. Growth in Germany came to a halt in the last quarter of 2019 as consumers became more cautious about spending, leaving the economy vulnerable as it begins to feel the effects of the coronavirus outbreak in China. Economic growth in Germany was 0 from October to December, the Federal Statistics Office said on Friday, down from 0.2% growth in the previous quarter. Problems in the car industry are not limited to Germany. Trump administration will raise tariffs on European aircraft. The Trump administration said it would raise tariffs on European aircraft in an effort to pressure Europe in a long-running trade dispute over airline subsidies. Under U.S. law, the United States Trade Representatives is required to periodically revisit and revise tariffs put in place as a part of the WTO dispute to put more pressure on negotiating partners to reach a resolution. Harry Root, the founder of the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance, A group that represents wine distributors and other professions in the United States said wine tariffs had done disproportionate damage to American business and consumers, and that European winemakers had responded by shipping more products to China instead. Mr. Root said that the administration had heard the industry's message loud and clear that wine tariffs were inefficient. Jeff Bezos buying a $165 million estate, a California record. The television producer Aaron Spelling had built the mansion in the city's Holmby Hills neighborhood in 1988. For Mr. Bezos, it was the Warner estate, which was designed in the 1930s for Jack Warner, the president of the Warner Brothers. The property is magnificent, said David Parnes of the Agency, a luxury real estate brokerage in Beverly Hills, who wasn't involved in the Warner estate deal. Warner died in 1978, but Ann Warner kept the estate largely intact and lived there until 1990, when Mr. Geffen paid $47.5 million for it, a record at the time for a Los Angeles area home. 3 U.S. airlines extend halt on Boeing 737 MAX flights. All 3 U.S. carriers that use Boeing's 737 MAX jetliner have again put off returning the plane to their schedules. Southwest Airlines said Thursday it would do likewise through August 10th. The 3 airlines had previously said they expected to bring the 737 MAX back in June, but none had provided a formal update since Boeing said last month it did not expect regulatory approval to fly the jet until June or July. The problems with the 737 MAX have created an opportunity for Airbus, Boeing's European rival, but Airbus had such a lengthy backlog it cannot immediately benefit from Boeing's troubles. A former owner of Newsweek pleads guilty in a fraud scheme. Etienne Uzak, a former co-owner of IBT Media, the one-time owner of Newsweek, and William Anderson, a former chief executive of Christian Media, both pleaded guilty to 1 count of each charge, said the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus R. Vance, Jr. The pleas followed a years-long investigation of ties between IBT Media and David Jang, a South Korean pastor, and Olivet University, a small Bible college he founded in Southern California. Journalists at Newsweek, including 2 top editors and a reporter, were fired in 2018 after they looked into IBT Media's financial dealings and legal troubles in the weeks after the raid. An attorney for IBT Media and Mr. Uzak, Mark Agnifilo, said in a statement on Friday, IBT Media is pleased to close this matter and looking forward to continue to grow the business, he added. We agreed to a resolution that does not involve jail, allows Mr. Uzak and all defendants the ability to put this chapter behind him. Two tax strategies to consider ahead of the 2020 election. The current exemption levels for the estate and gift taxes are so high that the tax applies to very few people, but both the exemption level and the tax rates could change if the next president wants to raise revenue. The estate tax is high on the list for many candidates because it can fill the tax coffers without affecting a lot of people. Mr. Pegg said that taking advantage of the high estate tax exemption and the valuation discount around closely held businesses could allow business owners to pass more of the wealth to heirs free of tax. Tips for decoding college financial aid offers. For now, there's still room for confusion, so students should carefully review their award letters and subsequent bills to make sure they reflect cost and aid correctly. Student advocates say all students who file the FAFSA, the federal application for student aid, receive the same electronic award letter, which includes a section for loans. If a student does not complete the form to decline the loan from award letter, the loan would appear on the student's term bill, Rutgers said. And that has been Reading the Times for this Saturday, February 15th, the year, of course, 2020!